The dust kicked up by the wagon wheels had long since settled when Jake Morrison first spotted the small figure hunched beside the rutted trail. He'd been riding hard for 3 days straight, pushing his sorrel mare through the unforgiving Texas heat, when something made him pull back on the reins. Maybe it was the way the afternoon sun caught the child's golden hair, or perhaps the sound that drifted across the prairie. A soft, broken sobbing that seemed to echo his own heart's pain. Jake had been running from ghosts for months now, ever since the bank foreclosure took his family's ranch. The same ranch his grandfather had carved from the wilderness with nothing but determination and bloody hands. 3 generations of Morrison sweat had soaked into that red dirt, and now it belonged to some eastern banker who'd never felt the bite of a branding iron or known the satisfaction of watching cattle grow fat on open range. He approached slowly, his weathered boots crunching on the dried grass. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her small frame wrapped in a dress that had once been white, but now bore the stains of hard travel and harder times. Her face was streaked with tears and dust, and when she lifted her head at the sound of his footsteps, Jake's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were the palest blue he'd ever seen, clouded with the telltale milkiness of blindness, yet somehow they seemed to look right through him to his very soul. "Hey there, little one," Jake said softly, removing his hat and crouching down to her level. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The girl's sobs quieted to sniffles, and she wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "My mama and papa," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the prairie wind. "The fever took them both. The wagon master said I was too much trouble, that I'd slow everyone down. He left me here with some water and hardtack, said someone would come for me." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd seen plenty of cruelty in his 32 years, but abandoning a blind child in the middle of nowhere was beyond his comprehension. The nearest town was a full day's ride, and the trail saw maybe 1 wagon train a week if you were lucky. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lucy," she said, turning her unseeing eyes toward his voice. "Lucy May Patterson. Are you here to take me to heaven to see Mama and Papa?" The innocence in her question hit Jake like a physical blow. He looked around at the endless expanse of prairie grass and mesquite, at the vultures circling lazily overhead, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "No, Lucy May," he said gently, gathering her small form into his arms. "I'm here to take you home." The ride back to what remained of Jake's world took 2 days. He'd sold most of his belongings when the bank came calling, but he still had a small cabin on the outskirts of Millbrook, a ramshackle place he'd planned to use as a base while he figured out his next move. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a well that ran clean, but it was honest shelter, and right now, that was more than Lucy May had. During the journey, she told him about her life in fragments, the way children do when trust comes slowly. Her parents had been heading west to Oregon, part of the Great Migration that swept families across the continent in search of better land and brighter futures. Her father had been a schoolteacher back in Missouri, her mother a seamstress with gentle hands and a voice like honey. Lucy had been born blind, but her parents had never treated her as broken or helpless. They'd taught her to navigate by sound and touch, to find her way in a world that relied so heavily on sight. "Papa used to read to me every night," she confided as they made camp the first evening. "Stories about brave knights and beautiful princesses. He said I could be anything I wanted to be, that my eyes didn't see the world, but my heart could see everything that mattered." Jake stirred the beans cooking over their small fire, his throat tight with emotion. "Your papa sounds like a wise man." "He was," Lucy said simply. "Mama said I had his stubborn streak and her gentle spirit. She said that combination would take me far in life, if I was brave enough to let it." That night, as Lucy slept curled up in Jake's spare bedroll, he stared up at the star-scattered sky and wondered what the hell he was doing. He was a broken-down cowboy with nothing to his name but a horse, a saddle, and a cabin that leaked when it rained. He knew nothing about raising children, especially a blind child who would need more care and attention than most. The sensible thing would be to take her to the nearest town, find some family willing to take her in, maybe the church or one of those orphan trains heading east. But every time he considered it, he thought about her small hand trustingly placed in his, the way she'd stopped crying the moment he'd promised to take care of her. Something in her faith in him awakened a part of himself he'd thought died with the ranch. The part that believed in protecting what mattered, in standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The cabin sat in a grove of oak trees about a mile from Millbrook's main street. It had belonged to Jake's Aunt Mercy, a spinster who'd lived alone for 40 years before consumption finally claimed her. She'd left it to Jake in her will, perhaps sensing that he might someday need a place to start over. The interior smelled of lavender and old memories, and dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. "It's not much," Jake said as he set Lucy down in the main room. "But it's got good bones and a roof that mostly keeps the rain out." Lucy stood perfectly still for a moment, her head tilted as she took in the sounds and smells of her new environment. Then she began to move slowly and carefully, her hands outstretched as she mapped the space in her mind. She found the rough wooden table, the rocking chair by the fireplace, the shelves lined with his aunt's collection of books and trinkets. Her fingers traced each surface with delicate precision, cataloging everything for future reference. "There's a bird outside," she said suddenly, pausing by the window. "Mockingbird, I think. Papa taught me to recognize their songs." Jake listened, and sure enough, there was a mockingbird perched on the oak branch just outside, running through its repertoire of borrowed melodies. He'd lived here for 3 months and never really noticed it before. "You're right," he said, amazed. "How did you know? You hear different things when you can't see?" Lucy explained matter-of-factly. "Papa said I was given extra sharp ears to make up for my eyes not working. I can tell you're standing about 6 feet away, that you're wearing leather boots with worn-down heels, and that you had beans and coffee for breakfast." Jake shook his head in wonder. The child's other senses were remarkably acute, compensating for her blindness in ways he was only beginning to understand. Over the following weeks, they settled into a routine that surprised them both with its naturalness. Jake would rise before dawn to tend to the small garden Aunt Mercy had planted behind the cabin, pulling weeds and watering the tomatoes and beans that would help stretch their meager food supplies. Lucy proved to be an eager helper despite her blindness, her nimble fingers perfect for shelling peas and snapping beans. Once Jake showed her how to distinguish between what was ready to pick and what needed more time to ripen. In the afternoons, he taught her practical skills: how to pump water from the well without soaking herself, how to safely navigate around the cabin's furniture, how to help with simple cooking tasks. Lucy absorbed everything with remarkable speed, her determination to be useful both heartbreaking and inspiring. But it was the evenings Jake treasured most. After supper, they would sit on the front porch as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Lucy would tell him stories she remembered from her parents, tales of far-off places and magical adventures that transported them both away from their current struggles. In return, Jake found himself sharing memories of his own childhood on the ranch, stories of cattle drives and roundups, of his grandfather's legendary stubbornness and his father's quiet wisdom. "Tell me about the horses," Lucy would say, leaning against his shoulder as the first stars appeared. "Tell me what it feels like to ride really fast across the prairie." Jake would close his eyes and try to find words for the sensation of thundering hooves beneath him, the way the wind whipped his face and the ground blurred past in a river of green and brown. "It's like flying, I reckon," he'd say. "Like the whole world opens up and you're part of something bigger than yourself. The horse's heart beating under you, the rhythm of the gallop, the way everything else just falls away until it's just you and the sky and the endless horizon. Someday," Lucy said with quiet conviction, "I'm going to learn to ride. Papa always said being blind didn't mean I had to live small." Jake's heart clenched at the hope in her voice. "Maybe you will, little one. Maybe you will." The challenges came quickly enough. Money was tight, tighter than tight. Jake had been living off his savings from selling his cattle, but that well was running dry fast. He took odd jobs around Millbrook when he could find them, fixing fences and shoeing horses, but the work was sporadic and the pay barely enough to keep food on the table. Lucy never complained, never asked for anything beyond the basics, but Jake saw how carefully she rationed her portions at meals, how she made her single dress last between washings. Worse than the financial strain was the judgment from the townspeople. Millbrook was a small place where everybody knew everybody else's business, and the sight of an unmarried cowboy raising a blind child raised eyebrows and wagging tongues. Some folks whispered that it wasn't proper, that a man had no business trying to care for a little girl on his own. Others wondered aloud about Jake's motives, casting dark suspicions that made his blood boil and his fists clench. The worst of it came from Ezra Whitmore, the bank president who'd foreclosed on Jake's family ranch. Whitmore was a small, spiteful man who wielded his financial power like a weapon, and he'd taken particular pleasure in bringing down the Morrison family after Jake's father had publicly opposed one of Whitmore's questionable business deals years earlier. Morrison, Whitmore said one day as Jake loaded supplies at Hartwell's general store, his voice dripping with false concern. "I hear you've taken in that unfortunate child. Very charitable of you, I'm sure, but hardly practical. A man in your reduced circumstances can barely provide for himself, let alone a child with special needs." Jake's hands stilled on the bag of flour he'd been loading into his saddlebags. "Lucy's doing just fine, thank you for asking." "Oh, I'm sure she is," Whitmore continued, his pale eyes glittering with malice. "But think of what's best for her, man. There are institutions back east, places specifically designed for children like her, people trained to handle their limitations. Surely that would be more appropriate than this makeshift arrangement you've cobbled together." "Lucy's not going anywhere," Jake said quietly, but his voice carried the steel of absolute certainty. "She's got a home with me." Whitmore's smile was cold and calculating. "For now, perhaps, but when the bills pile up and you can't afford to feed her properly, when you realize you're in over your head, you'll see reason. I have connections, Morrison. I can arrange for her placement somewhere suitable. It would be the kindest thing, really." Jake turned then, his full attention focused on the banker with an intensity that made Whitmore take an involuntary step backward. "Let me make something crystal clear to you, Whitmore. That little girl is under my protection now. Anyone who tries to take her away from me will have to go through me first, and I promise you, that's not a fight they want to pick." The confrontation left Jake shaken, not because of Whitmore's threats, but because of the kernel of truth buried in the man's cruel words. He was struggling financially, and Lucy did deserve better than what he could currently provide. That night, as she slept peacefully in the small bed he'd built for her in the cabin's second room, Jake sat at the kitchen table and tallied up their resources for the 100th time. The numbers hadn't magically improved, and winter was coming fast. He was so absorbed in his calculations that he almost missed the soft sound of bare feet on the wooden floor. Lucy appeared in the doorway, her white nightgown ghostly in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Jakey," she whispered. "Are you worried about something?" He looked up, startled by her intuitive question. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" "You've been sighing a lot lately," she said, padding over to his chair. "And you don't eat much at supper anymore. Papa used to do that when he was worried about money." Jake's throat tightened. Even at 8 years old, Lucy was perceptive beyond her years, reading the emotions of those around her through subtle cues most people would miss. "Come here," he said softly, pulling her onto his lap. Lucy settled against his chest, her small hand finding the steady beat of his heart. "Is it because of me?" she asked in a voice so quiet he almost missed it. "Because I'm blind and I cost too much to take care of." The question hit Jake like a physical blow. "Lucy May Patterson, you listen to me and listen good," he said fiercely, tilting her chin up though he knew she couldn't see his face. "You are not a burden. You are not too much trouble. You are the best thing that's happened to me in longer than I care to remember, and I wouldn't trade you for all the money in Texas. Do you understand me?" Tears leaked from Lucy's clouded eyes, but Mr. Whitmore at the bank said, "You heard that?" Jake asked, his heart sinking. "I was waiting outside while you got supplies," Lucy admitted. "I hear most everything people say about us. About how you can't take proper care of me, how I'd be better off in one of those places for broken children." Jake gathered her closer, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. "You are not broken, Lucy. You hear me. You're perfect exactly as you are. Those people don't know what they're talking about, and they sure don't know you like I do. Promise," Lucy whispered, clinging to his shirt. "I promise," Jake said solemnly. "We're family now, you and me, and family sticks together no matter what." But promises, Jake learned, were easier to make than to keep. As autumn turned to winter, their situation grew more desperate. Work dried up completely as the cold weather set in, and Jake watched their food supplies dwindle with growing panic. He took to skipping meals himself, claiming he wasn't hungry while making sure Lucy ate enough to keep growing. She never said anything, but he caught her sneaking portions back onto his plate when she thought he wasn't looking. The breaking point came on a bitter December morning when Jake woke to find Lucy burning with fever. She'd caught a chill that settled deep in her lungs, and within hours she was struggling to breathe, her small body racked with violent coughing fits that brought up flecks of blood. The nearest doctor was in Millbrook, but Jake had exactly 37 cents to his name, nowhere near enough to pay for medical care. He bundled Lucy in every blanket they owned and rode hard for town, his mare's hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground. Dr. Samuel Chen was a kind man who'd come west from San Francisco to serve the frontier communities, and he took one look at Lucy's condition and immediately ushered them into his examination room. Pneumonia. He diagnosed grimly after listening to her labored breathing. She needs medicine and round-the-clock care, or... He didn't finish the sentence, but Jake heard the unspoken words anyway. Or she could die. I can't pay you right now, Jake said quietly, his pride burning like acid in his throat. But I'll work it off, whatever it takes, Doctor. Chen studied Jake's face for a long moment. I don't doubt that, Mr. Morrison. But this child needs treatment immediately, not promises of future payment. Jake's hands clenched into fists. Please, she's all I got left in this world. Actually, came a voice from the doorway. I believe I can help with the financial arrangements. Jake turned to see a woman he didn't recognize, tall and elegant, with prematurely gray hair and kind brown eyes. She wore a traveling dress of fine wool and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I'm Margaret Sinclair, she said, extending a gloved hand to Jake, and I believe you have something that belongs to me. Jake stared at her in confusion. Mom. Margaret's gaze shifted to Lucy, who was fighting to stay conscious despite the fever ravaging her small body. This is Lucy Mae Patterson, isn't it? Daughter of Thomas and Sarah Patterson. You knew her parents. Jake asked, hope and fear warring in his chest. Thomas Patterson was my nephew, Margaret said softly, tears gathering in her eyes as she looked at Lucy. My sister's boy. I've been searching for this child since I received word about Thomas and Sarah's death. The wagon master told me she'd been left somewhere along the trail, but no one could tell me exactly where. Jake felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Lucy had family, real family, with the means to care for her properly. Everything he'd tried to provide, everything he'd struggled to give her. This woman could offer without thinking twice about the cost. I'll pay for her medical treatment. Margaret continued, already reaching for her purse. Decker Chen, whatever she needs, spare no expense. And Mr. Morrison, she turned back to Jake with a grateful smile, I cannot thank you enough for caring for her. If you hadn't found her, she's not going anywhere, Jake said suddenly, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. Lucy stays with me. Margaret's eyebrows rose. Mr. Morrison, I understand you've grown attached to the child, but surely you must see. No. Jake interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. You don't understand. She's my daughter now. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters. I won't let you take her away. Jake. Lucy's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension in the room like a blade. Is that you? He was at her side in an instant, taking her small hand in both of his. I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here. I heard voices, she said weakly. Who's the lady? Jake glanced at Margaret, then back at Lucy's fever-bright face. Her name is Margaret Sinclair. She says she's your papa's aunt. She's your family, Lucy. Lucy was quiet for so long that Jake thought she'd fallen back to sleep. When she finally spoke, her words were clear despite her illness. Family isn't just blood, she said softly. Papa taught me that. Family is the people who choose to love you, who stay with you when things get hard. You chose me, Jake. By the roadside that day, you chose me when nobody else would. Jake's vision blurred as tears he'd been holding back for months finally broke free. I'll always choose you, little one. Always. Margaret watched this exchange with growing understanding, her business-like demeanor softening. Perhaps, she said carefully, we should focus on getting Lucy well first, and then discuss what's best for her future. The next weeks were a blur of medicine and sleepless nights, of hovering between hope and despair as Lucy fought for her life. Jake never left her side, sleeping in a chair beside her bed, spooning broth between her lips when she was conscious enough to swallow. Margaret paid for everything without question. The medicine, the doctor's visits, even groceries for Jake so he wouldn't have to leave Lucy's side to hunt for work. During the long hours of Lucy's recovery, Jake and Margaret talked. She told him about her life back in Philadelphia, where she'd built a successful millinery business after her husband's death. She owned a large house with servants, had investments and social connections that could open doors Lucy would never see otherwise. She could provide education, culture, opportunities that a struggling cowboy could never offer. "I don't want to take her from you," Margaret said one evening as they sat beside Lucy's bed, watching the rise and fall of her breathing. "I can see how much you love each other, but I can also see that you're barely surviving out here. What happens the next time she gets sick? Or if you get hurt and can't work? What then?" Jake had no answer for that, because the truth was exactly what Margaret suspected. He was living day to day, hand to mouth, with no security to offer Lucy beyond his stubborn determination to protect her. "Come with us," Margaret said suddenly. "Both of you. Come back to Philadelphia with me." Jake stared at her. "Mom, I'm not a young woman anymore," Margaret continued. "I have no children of my own, and Lucy is the closest thing to family I have left. But she doesn't need another spinster aunt trying to raise her alone. She needs a father, someone who understands her spirit and won't try to cage it just because she's blind." "I'm a cowboy," Jake said helplessly. "I don't know anything about city life. And I don't know anything about raising a child," Margaret replied with a smile. "But together, we might just figure it out. I can provide financial security and educational opportunities. You can provide the love and understanding she needs to grow into the remarkable woman I can already see she's going to become." When Lucy finally recovered enough to sit up and take notice of the world around her, she found Jake and Margaret deep in conversation about train schedules and arrangements. The fever had left her thinner and weaker, but her spirit was unchanged. "Are we really going on a train?" she asked excitedly. "Papa always promised he'd take me on a real train someday." Jake exchanged a look with Margaret, then reached for Lucy's hand. "How would you feel about living in a big city for a while? Philadelphia's got museums and libraries, schools where they can teach you to read with your fingers. Braille," Margaret added. "It's called Braille, and there are wonderful schools there that specialize in teaching children like you." Lucy tilted her head, considering this information with the serious concentration she brought to all major decisions. "Would you be there too, Jake? Or are you going back to being a cowboy? Wherever you go, I go." Jake promised. "We're a family now, remember? All three of us?" Lucy asked, including Margaret with a gesture toward her voice. Margaret's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother to hide. "If you'll have me, dear heart, I would be honored to be part of your family." The journey east was Lucy's first train ride, and she pressed her face to the window despite being unable to see the landscape rushing past. She mapped the journey through sound and vibration, the clatter of wheels on rails, the whistle echoing across vast distances, the gentle swaying that rocked her to sleep in Jake's arms as they traveled through the night. Philadelphia was overwhelming at first, a chaos of sounds and smells and sensations that made Lucy cling to Jake's hand as they navigated the crowded streets. But Margaret's house was a sanctuary, 3 stories of warm brick and polished wood, with a garden where mockingbirds sang in the oak trees, and a library filled with more books than Lucy had ever imagined existed. Jake struggled with the transition more than Lucy did. The city felt like a trap to someone who'd spent his life under open skies, and he found himself standing at the upstairs windows for hours, staring out at the horizon and fighting the urge to saddle up and ride west until he found familiar territory. But then Lucy would call for him, needing help with something, or Margaret would ask his opinion about Lucy's education, and he'd remember why he was there. The school Margaret had found was a revelation. The Maryland School for the Blind had teachers who understood how to unlock the potential in children like Lucy, who saw her condition not as a limitation, but as a different way of experiencing the world. They taught her to read Braille with fingertips that flew across the raised dots, to write with special equipment, to navigate independently using a white cane and her own acute hearing. But it was the music teacher who truly opened Lucy's world. Mrs. Henderson was a patient woman who recognized Lucy's natural gift for melody and rhythm, the same sensitivity that had helped her identify bird songs and read emotions in people's voices. Within months, Lucy was playing piano with a skill that amazed everyone who heard her, her sightless fingers finding melodies that seemed to come from her very soul. "She has real talent," Mrs. Henderson told Jake and Margaret during one of their regular conferences. "With proper training, she could be a professional musician someday. A concert pianist, maybe, or a composer." Jake watched through the classroom window as Lucy played, her small body swaying with the music, her face radiant with joy. This was what he could never have given her in their little cabin, the chance to discover her gifts, to become everything her father had dreamed she could be. Years passed. Lucy grew from a fragile child into a confident young woman, her blindness an obstacle she'd learned to navigate with grace and determination. She excelled at her studies, mastered multiple instruments, and developed friendships with other students who understood her world. Jake found his own place in their new life, working as a riding instructor at a nearby stable where city children learned the basics of horsemanship. Margaret had been right. Together, they made an unconventional but loving family. On Lucy's 16th birthday, she gave a recital at the school, her own compositions played for an audience of family and friends. Jake sat in the front row beside Margaret, his heart nearly bursting with pride as Lucy's fingers danced across the keys, creating music that painted pictures more vivid than any sunset he'd ever seen. After the recital, as they walked home through the gaslit streets, Lucy slipped her hand into the crook of Jake's arm the way she had when she was little. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up the life you knew for me?" Jake stopped walking and turned to face her, this remarkable young woman who'd become the center of his world. "Lucy May," he said, using the full name he'd called her that first day by the roadside. "You didn't take me away from my life. You gave me one worth living." Lucy smiled, the same radiant expression that had first captured his heart all those years ago. "I know you still miss it sometimes," she said. "The wide open spaces, the freedom to ride wherever you wanted. I can hear it in your voice when you tell stories about the old days." "Maybe I do," Jake admitted, "but I wouldn't trade a single day of watching you grow into who you've become. Your papa was right, you know. You can be anything you want to be." "I want to be like you," Lucy said simply. "Someone who sees a person in trouble and doesn't walk away. Someone who chooses love even when it's hard." As they resumed walking, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd lost everything he'd thought mattered: his family's ranch, his identity as a cowboy, the life he'd planned to live. But sometimes he'd learned, losing everything was just another way of making room for something better. The little blind girl who'd been crying by the roadside was gone, replaced by a young woman with her own dreams and ambitions. But she was still his Lucy, still the daughter of his heart if not his blood. And that roadside moment, when he'd made the choice to stop and care, had changed them both in ways neither could have imagined. That night, as Jake sat on the back porch of Margaret's house, listening to the familiar song of a mockingbird in the darkness, Lucy joined him with her guitar. She'd been working on a new composition, she said, something inspired by the stories he used to tell her about the prairie. As her fingers found the melody, Jake closed his eyes and let the music carry him back to that endless expanse of grass and sky. But this time, he wasn't alone on the range. This time, he was surrounded by the family he'd chosen and who had chosen him in return, bound together not by blood, but by something stronger. The decision to love without reservation, to protect without question, to stand by each other through whatever storms might come. The song Lucy played was beautiful and wild, full of longing and hope, and the kind of joy that comes from finding home in unexpected places. It was the sound of their story, Jake realized, the tale of a broken-down cowboy and a blind child who'd saved each other by the simple act of refusing to give up on love. When the last note faded into the night air, Lucy turned toward him with tears on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, "for stopping that day. For choosing me." Jake reached over and took her hand, this remarkable woman who'd taught him that sometimes the greatest adventures weren't about riding toward the horizon, but about staying put and watching someone you love discover their wings. "Thank you for letting me," he replied, and meant every word.